Yes, so I gave another talk on is your business strategy still fit for purpose when COVID hit, and now we've got war in Europe. There's just over the waves are just overlapping. We've got climate change. We've got so many potential risks out there. So there's a nice three-dimensional a framework with three dimensions that talks about the strategic environmental landscape that a company is participating in, or that a leader of that a leader of a company is involved with. So, the three main dimensions when you look at strategy. There's unpredictability. How unpredictable is it? Is it uh, low unpredictability or high unpredictability? And then you've got malleability. You as a company, to what degree can we shape that environment? So those are the two main axes along which the environment can differ. And then you've got a third axis, which COVID highlighted, which is harshness. Right? When most of the world shut down, many revenue streams completely dried up. So that's an incredibly harsh environment. That's like in the desert when the camel has to be able to. The camel has one or two humps. He or she's built for that. Most
Yeah.
other animals, if you take a polar bear, you put them in the desert, they're going to have trouble. Then if there's no water, it's even worse. So many people found themselves as polar bears in a camel environment, and they weren't ready for it.
Mm.
So there's research that shows this in simulation. A Boston Consulting Group did a bit of work on this, where and if you were to lay that out, you've got the famous NBA 2x2 grid, where if you've got a highly unpredictable environment that you can't shape as a company, it calls for an adaptive strategy, where the imperative there is to be fast, right?
Yeah.
And then basically there are four quadrants there just to fill it out, right? So you have to be adaptive if it's high unpredictability, low malleability. Then if it's not that unpredictable, and you can't really shape it, then it's a classic strategy, which is be first, be big sort of thing.
Yeah.
Then if you can shape it, but the environment, if you can shape it and you can kind of predict it, then you can do the visionary approach. Maybe Steve Jobs at Apple, he kind of took a call there and went for it, right?
Hmm.
And then if
Hmm.
and then if you can shape it and it's unpredictable, then you can be a leader in that. So your company can be a leader in that space,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
Amazon is doing, and you're right, orchestrating lots of things. So here's the thing: as a leader, like I said, strategy is a fit between an organization and its environment. The environment is changing very rapidly, so lots of places for errors to be introduced. If you're in the boardroom and you're trying to assess what the environment is, you got to make sure you get that assessment right, and then you got to figure out what is our strategic response to that, and then are we executing the intended strategy that we set out, or is organizational friction and all the things that you both alluded to earlier getting in the way of us executing on it? So I'll pause
Yeah.
there. But that, long story short, means the current environment for many companies who can't shape it too much and they're dealing with unpredictability is an adaptive strategy.
I think what's coming out so far for me is that there definitely needs to be, Heather mentioned the toolkit, but I would probably say it's a toolbox with many different kits in it for this new realm of leadership. Because you we mentioned the whole notion of adaptability. What does that mean? Agility, malleability, resilience, efficiency, strategy. How do we build a strategy where all of that is concerned? And then, Heather, something that I know that you've done lots of work on, etc., is the whole notion of horizon scanning. Like, how as a leader do we take all of this and make sure that we're building a strategy that is fit for purpose 10, 20 years down the line, but still has the agility and the flexibility and the resilience built in? Like, it seems like we need to kind of build a complete master's program around this topic right now.
Yes. When I started doing futures work, which was about 12 years ago now, it took me a little while to realize that the skill sets you need are actually different. So this isn't just about how do you change some of the conventional toolkits. It's actually about developing some different skills. And what I spend a lot of
Sure.
my time looking for is looking for patterns. So people say to
Mm,
me, you must do a hell of a lot of research. And I say, well, no, I don't. I spend about 10, 15% of my time reading stuff all the time. But what I'm doing with that is I'm looking at the headlines and I'm looking at the landscape that's in my head for the future. And I'm saying, does that change my landscape? In other words, is the pattern changing on my landscape? Now, that's not how leaders in business tend to work. That's very much at this point in time, I'll do a pile of research and I'll make my decisions based on that. And then I'll revisit in 6 months, 3 months, 3 years, whatever is my time frame I've decided. And I really think that there's some really fundamental questions that leaders will need to ask themselves. So one of the first questions is, how many versions of the future do I need? Because
Mm-hmm.
there ain't one future. And to some extent,
Yes.
you can influence it, and to a great extent, lots of other factors will do it. So you really need to have a number of possible futures, in my view, and then you need to understand how robust your business model, your operating model, your strategy is against those different possible futures. That's point one. Point two, you can't set out a detailed strategy for all of those. What you have to have, to my mind, is a North Star, a direction of travel, which needs to be authentic, by the way, coming back to purpose, with the purpose that you've set out for your business, but also coherent where your business has come from. Otherwise, it's not authentic. You need a North Star, and then it's about how do you have a short term strategy that keeps you pushing in your current environment on track towards that North Star, leaving you the
Mm.
agility to move if the external environment changes, but without changing your North Star. And that's a very, very different
Okay.
way of
Sure.
thinking from the strategic, let's have a plan, let's have it all laid out, let's be able to explain to our investors exactly what we're going to look like in a year or two's time.
Yeah. I like that, and we do that as well. In our business, we have these, we call them OKRs, and although we set the OKR for a 2 year horizon, we kind of break it down to, okay, what are the OKRs for this 12 month period, but then we also go back and break it down per quarter. And at the end of every quarter, we revisit the entire OKR plan to see, okay, do we need to change? Do we need to pivot? Do we need to remove some stuff and add some stuff in? And this is not just me as the CEO and founder of the business doing that. Every single member of staff, right? The senior leadership team, the person in IT, every single person has to go through that, what we call a self-evaluation, and look at what were the OKRs for me over the past quarter, pinning to the OKRs, the strategic OKRs, and then also look at what the next quarter would look like, etc. So Carl, how often should leaders be, re-examining their strategy, taking into consideration this new all this new ecosystem of what leadership should look like?
Sure. So where I want to take the conversation, I'll address those points, is picking up on what Heather said. And Heather, you mentioned investors. So I have a strong background in ESG. My whole career has been an impact, right? So one of the things, back to scenarios and scenario planning, you're absolutely right in that regard. There are lots of potential futures. So what any company, anyone from any company who's listening, what's really helpful is that the big central banks have put together what they see as their view of the potential scenarios going forward. It's from a climate change perspective in terms of how orderly the transition to a low carbon economy will be, and basically there are different dimensions there, but it has to do with how quickly certain governments act and give a clear line of sight versus how organically it emerges and which parts of the world are on top of it and not, and which ones have more trouble or not. So basically, but those scenarios have already been delineated by the central banks. And there's something called the TCFD, which is a task force for climate related financial disclosures,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
Mark Carney, I've got Mark Carney's book here, by the way. I'd recommend it to people. It's called Values, right? Former Bank of England governor and Bank of Canada governor. But Mark Carney was chairing that initiative, and they basically reached out to a lot of the largest companies in the world that do public reporting, and they said, okay, now the investors and shareholders want to know, the big pension funds and other institutional investors want to know the amount of risk and opportunity, but the amount of risk these companies are exposed to. They now need to do more combined reporting, rather they need to do a double materiality or dual materiality, the financial materiality and the ESG or environmentally, the climate-related materiality. That's forcing companies to take a more strategic, a more integrated systems-level view on their business and the internality, externalities, all of that. So there are some base case scenarios out there you can look into. Now that's just from a climate perspective, but that's going to affect. And sorry, the other point is that TCFD, those regulations are coming into effect this year for publicly traded companies in the UK.
Yes.
They're becoming law.
Yeah.
And they will be, and the SEC is looking into it. So it's basically the direction of travel is clear. So from that perspective, there is a framework which lays out some of the main areas that companies need to become conversant in this space, because arguably there are many overlapping risks, as Heather talked about, and I imagine you specialize in this, Heather. However, climate change is one of the big overarching ones, and basically what's happening is the agreements, the country level commitments that were made in the Paris 2015 Accord are now being translated. There are legal precedents with the Shell case and others where those country level targets are now being translated at company level. So if a company says we're on target for net zero, but their KPIs and goals, their targets are not on that path for it, they can then be pulled up and say, actually, you're not mapping toward meeting the country level goals that your country agreed to. So that gives a big picture frame. So when you're looking at the possible futures, those really helpful base cases. So I'll pause there. In terms of how often you need to revisit it, that's a longer discussion, but hopefully that's helpful in terms of scene setting, because from my perspective, Heather, absolutely right. If garbage in, garbage out, right? If you take the same old business and operating model and you put these new data inputs into it, as you said, if you're taking non-linear inputs into a linear system, they're going to be shaved down and not be as useful. You and I both have fairly sophisticated mental models, so when those inputs come in, we do the pattern recognition, as you say, right? So, but the average, I would liken it to this almost, really. So, I grew up in a big corporate. I worked at Johnson & Johnson, wonderful company, and then I moved to mid-size and smaller companies. Then I formed my own business. And wow, Stephen Covey famously said, and he's a leadership advisor, right? He was a professor and everything. He said the hardest shift for him was when he moved from being an advisor advising other companies to then having to run his own business and dealing with eating his own cooking, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I had to go from being like when you work. I mean this affectionately. I was an employee for a long time. If you're working in a big company, you're almost like it's like the difference between a domesticated dog and a wolf. Yeah. Yes, one is used to hunting and reading the signals, and has not become accustomed to the food bowl being there every morning when they wake up, or the paycheck coming every couple of weeks, right?
Absolutely.
So each of us, in terms of that build, test, learn, and we need to realize, we need to kind of, like also if you have pets, birds as pets, they can't fly as far as they used to in the wild. They just lose the capability. So we each have gotten a bit, I would say, lazy because we haven't had to do it. But now, if we don't do it, the business won't exist. I'll pause there.
Thank you for watching. To watch the full episode of this podcast, tap or click on the video on the screen. And to find out more about us, you can go to our website, lumerous.com.